The moment my daughter-in-law let my dinner plate slip from her hands and hit the restaurant floor, I realized she hadn't invited me there to share a meal, she had invited me to be humiliated. The sound wasn't loud, not really, just a sharp crack against polished tile that cut through the soft clinking of silverware and low conversations around us, but it was enough to turn heads, enough to freeze the air at our table, enough to make every eye in that place land on me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, as if I were still waiting for my meal instead of watching it lie scattered at my feet. Which, Vanessa said, her voice just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, her lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile, "You should have never come." I remember thinking how strange it was that she said it like a fact, not an insult, like she was correcting a mistake that should have never been made in the first place. Around us, the restaurant carried on in that awkward, half-paused way places do when something uncomfortable happens in public. A waiter hovered a few steps away, unsure whether to approach. A couple at the next table exchanged glances. Someone cleared their throat. But no one spoke. And neither did my son. Daniel sat across from me, his shoulders stiff, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my right shoulder as if I had already disappeared from the scene. He didn't reach for me. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even say my name. And somehow, that silence was louder than the sound of the plate breaking. I lowered my eyes briefly, not out of shame, but to take in the small details, the smear of sauce against the tile, the edge of the porcelain plate chipped clean in half, the way my fork had landed just inches from my shoe. Ordinary things. Simple things. But in that moment, they felt like evidence. Not of an accident, but of intention. Because nothing about this felt sudden. Nothing about this felt like a loss of control. Vanessa didn't look surprised. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked prepared. I could see it in the stillness of her posture, in the way her hand rested calmly against the table as if she had already rehearsed this moment in her mind. And slowly, quietly, something inside me shifted. Not shattered. Not even cracked. Just settled. Like a truth finally finding its place after being denied for far too long. I had spent years telling myself that the tension between us was misunderstanding. That her coldness was personality. That her distance was stress, or timing, or anything other than what it truly was. I had explained away the missed invitations, the last-minute cancellations, the way conversations would fall silent when I entered a room. I had told myself families were complicated. That love didn't always look warm. That patience would fix what felt broken. But sitting there, in that restaurant, with strangers watching and my own son refusing to meet my eyes, I understood something I should have accepted long ago. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. And this moment right here was not the beginning. It was the reveal. I lifted my gaze again, meeting Vanessa's eyes for just a second. She held it, unflinching, almost expectant, as if waiting for me to react, to raise my voice, to give her something she could use. But I didn't. I simply breathed in, slow and steady, and let the silence stretch between us. Because in that silence, I could see it more clearly than ever. This dinner had never been about reconciliation. It had never been about family. It had been arranged, set, and served with one purpose in mind. And as I sat there, perfectly still, while the fragments of my dinner lay at my feet, I realized something else just as important. She thought this moment would break me. She thought this would be the point where I finally showed weakness, where I became exactly what she had been calling me all along. But she was wrong. And she didn't know it yet. None of them did. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier, printed on thick cream cardstock as if it were announcing something far more important than a simple dinner, and I remember running my fingers over the edges of it while standing in my kitchen, wondering when was the last time Daniel had invited me anywhere in such a formal way. He had called shortly after, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, saying it had been too long since we had all sat down together, that Vanessa had found a new place downtown everyone was talking about, that it would be nice to catch up, just the three of us, like we used to. I had paused before answering, not because I did not want to go, but because something about his tone felt unfamiliar, like a stranger wearing my son's voice. Still, I said yes. Of course I said yes. Mothers do not turn down invitations from their children, not when there is even the smallest chance it might mean things are getting better. That afternoon, I took more time than usual getting ready. I stood in front of my closet longer than I care to admit, brushing my fingers over dresses I had not worn in years, finally choosing a soft grey one that Daniel once said made me look elegant. I fixed my hair carefully, pinned it back just the way I used to when we would go out as a family, and I even reached for the small bottle of perfume I had been saving, the one with the faint scent of lavender that always made me feel a little more like myself. It was not about impressing Vanessa. It was never about her. It was about showing up with dignity, about reminding myself that I still belonged in the spaces my family occupied, even if I had started to feel like a guest in my own life. The restaurant itself was exactly what you would expect from a place that required reservations days in advance, dim lighting that softened every edge, white tablecloths stretched perfectly across polished tables, and a quiet hum of conversation that made everything feel private even when it was not. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, standing near the host stand, his hands tucked into his pockets as if he did not quite know what to do with them. He smiled when he saw me, but it did not reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile you give out of habit, not out of feeling. He leaned in to hug me, brief and careful, like he was afraid of staying too long. Vanessa was seated at the table, scrolling through her phone, and she did not look up right away when we approached. When she finally did, her expression shifted quickly into something polite, something practiced. She stood, leaned in, and gave me a light embrace that felt more like a gesture than a greeting. "You made it," she said, as if there had been some doubt, as if my presence required confirmation. I nodded, smiling gently, taking my seat as the waiter pulled out the chair for me. For a moment, everything seemed normal. We ordered drinks. Daniel asked about my drive, about the weather, about small things that filled space but meant nothing. Vanessa chimed in occasionally, her voice smooth, her words carefully chosen, each sentence balanced between friendliness and distance. I watched them both, not openly, but in the way you do when you are trying to understand something that does not quite make sense. There were pauses that felt too long. Glances exchanged that ended too quickly. A tension beneath the surface that did not match the calm tone of the conversation. At one point, Vanessa laughed at something Daniel said, a soft, controlled sound, and for a split second, her eyes flicked toward me, not with warmth, but with something sharper, something measuring. It was subtle. So subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But I did not. I have spent a lifetime reading the spaces between words, noticing the things people think they are hiding. And what I saw in that brief moment was not discomfort. It was anticipation. As if she was waiting for something. As if the evening had already been decided, and we were simply moving through the steps required to get there. I remember folding my napkin carefully over my lap, smoothing it down with steady hands, telling myself not to overthink, not to let old doubts cloud what might be a genuine attempt at connection. But even then, even before anything had happened, there was a quiet voice in the back of my mind, one I had ignored too many times before, whispering that this was not what it appeared to be. And I should have listened. The menus arrived with quiet precision, placed gently in front of us as if the evening were unfolding exactly as it should, and for a moment, I let myself believe that perhaps I had imagined the tension, that maybe this dinner could still become something simple and normal. I opened the menu slowly, scanning the options without really reading them, aware of the way Vanessa's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a soft, rhythmic sound that did not match the calm expression on her face. Daniel cleared his throat and began talking about work, about a new project, about deadlines and meetings, his words flowing steadily but without substance, like he was filling space rather than sharing anything real. I nodded when it seemed appropriate, offering small responses, asking polite questions, playing my part in a conversation that felt more like a script than a connection. Vanessa chimed in occasionally, adding details about their plans, their schedules, their life together, always using the word we, always reinforcing the idea that whatever existed between them did not include me. At one point, the waiter returned to take our order, and Vanessa spoke first, her voice confident and clear, selecting her meal without hesitation. Daniel followed, barely glancing at the menu before choosing something quickly. When it was my turn, I hesitated just long enough to notice it, the way Vanessa's eyes lifted slightly, watching me, not impatiently, but with a quiet curiosity, as if my choice mattered more than it should. I ordered something simple, something familiar, and handed the menu back with a polite smile. The waiter nodded and disappeared, leaving us once again in that carefully constructed silence. It was then that I began to notice the smaller things, the details that do not announce themselves but reveal everything if you are paying attention. The way Daniel avoided looking at me for more than a second at a time. The way Vanessa's smile never quite reached her eyes. The way their shoulders angled slightly toward each other, creating a subtle barrier that I could feel even across the table. I have sat at enough dinner tables in my life to understand when I am part of the conversation and when I am simply present for it. And in that moment, I understood that I was not there to be included. I was there to witness something. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip, giving myself a moment to think, to listen, to feel the weight of what was not being said. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested comfort, not tension. That was what struck me the most. She was comfortable. Not nervous, not uncertain, not even cautious. Comfortable. As if everything was unfolding exactly as she expected. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into himself, his hands moving restlessly, adjusting his napkin, tapping lightly against the table, reaching for his glass even when it was still full. There was a difference between them that could not be ignored. One of them knew what was coming. The other was trying not to think about it. And somewhere in between, I sat, quietly observing, quietly understanding more with each passing second. Vanessa asked me a question then, something simple on the surface, about how I had been spending my time lately, but there was something in the way she said it, something in the slight tilt of her head, the careful softness of her tone, that made it feel less like interest and more like evaluation. I answered honestly, speaking about small routines, about quiet mornings and familiar habits, about the kind of life that does not demand attention but still holds its own meaning. She listened, nodding occasionally, her expression attentive but distant, as if she were collecting information rather than connecting with it. When I finished, she smiled again, that same controlled smile, and glanced briefly at Daniel before looking back at me. It was a quick movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried something with it, something unspoken, something agreed upon. And in that brief exchange, I felt it settle deeper in my chest, that quiet certainty I had been trying to ignore. This was not a dinner meant to bring us closer. It was a stage. And I had been placed on it without being told the script. I set my glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, keeping my movements calm, deliberate, steady. Because if there is one thing I have learned over the years, it is that when something does not feel right, when the air shifts in a way you cannot explain, when people begin to behave like actors instead of family, you do not rush to react. You watch. You listen. And you wait for the moment when the truth can no longer hide behind polite conversation. And as I sat there, across from my son and the woman he had chosen to build his life with, I knew that moment was coming. I could feel it, quiet but certain, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right second to arrive. The food arrived without ceremony, carried by a waiter who seemed unaware of the quiet tension that had already settled over our table, and for a brief moment, everything appeared ordinary again, plates placed carefully, utensils aligned, a soft enjoy your meal offered before he stepped away, leaving us alone with something far heavier than dinner. I looked down at my plate, taking in the details, the arrangement, the effort that had gone into something meant to be enjoyed, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so carefully prepared could feel so out of place. Vanessa adjusted her posture slightly, lifting her fork with a measured ease, her movements unhurried, controlled, almost deliberate in their calmness. Daniel followed, though his hand hesitated for just a second before reaching for his knife, a small pause that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by me. I have spent years noticing pauses. They say more than words ever do. For a few minutes, we ate in near silence, the kind that is not peaceful but expectant, like everyone is waiting for something to happen but no one wants to be the one to start it. I took small, careful bites, not because I was hungry, but because it gave me something to do, something to anchor myself in the moment while I listened, while I watched, while I tried to understand where this evening was truly headed. Vanessa set her fork down first. Not abruptly, not loudly, just enough to shift the rhythm at the table. The soft clink against the plate was subtle, but it changed something. Daniel's hand stilled. My own movements slowed. And then she spoke. "You know," she began, her tone light, almost conversational, as if she were about to share something harmless. "There are some people who just do not know when they are no longer welcome." The words hung in the air, not directed at anyone explicitly, but placed carefully enough that their meaning could not be mistaken. I did not respond. I kept my gaze lowered for a moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel intentional, then lifted my eyes to meet hers briefly. She held my gaze, steady and unflinching, her expression composed, almost curious, as if she were studying my reaction rather than participating in a conversation. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening slightly around his utensil, but he said nothing. Again, nothing. That silence repeated itself, heavier this time, more deliberate. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her lips forming a faint smile that did not carry warmth, and she continued, "It must be difficult, not realizing when it is time to step back." There it was. Clearer now. No longer hidden behind implication, but still wrapped in just enough politeness to make confrontation seem unnecessary, almost inappropriate. I placed my fork down gently, aligning it with the edge of my plate, my movements calm, precise, unhurried. "If you have something to say," I replied quietly, my voice even, "you can say it directly." The table fell still. Not tense. Not explosive. Just still, like everything had paused to see what she would do next. Vanessa's smile widened slightly, not with joy, but with something sharper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. "All right," she said softly, her voice lowering just enough to draw attention without raising it, "then I will." And for a brief second, Daniel looked up, his eyes flicking between us, as if he wanted to interrupt, as if he wanted to stop what was about to happen, but whatever thought crossed his mind did not turn into action. It never did. Vanessa reached for the edge of my plate, her fingers resting lightly against it, not gripping, not forcing, just touching it in a way that felt almost casual, almost careless. And then, with a small, deliberate motion, she let it slip. It was not violent. It was not sudden. It was controlled. Intentional. The plate slid from the table, tipped, and met the floor with that same sharp sound that echoed through the room, drawing every eye once again to where we sat today. And in that exact moment, as the last piece of porcelain settled against the tile, she leaned back slightly, her gaze fixed on me, and said the words she had been holding all evening. "Which," she said, her voice steady, unshaken, "you should have never come." For a moment, no one moved, not even the people at the nearby tables who had turned to look, their expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort, as if they were unsure whether they had just witnessed something real or something they should pretend not to see. I remained seated, my hands still resting quietly in my lap, my posture unchanged, my breathing steady, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. It was not denial. It was control. Because the truth was, the moment the plate touched the floor, something inside me had already gone still. Not broken. Not shaken. Just still. Vanessa held her position, leaning back slightly, her gaze fixed on me with a kind of quiet satisfaction, as if she had finally reached the point she had been working toward all along. Daniel shifted again, his chair making a faint sound against the floor, but he still did not speak. He looked at me then, briefly, and in his eyes I did not see anger, or even confusion. I saw something far more difficult to accept. I saw avoidance. As if looking directly at what had just happened would require him to acknowledge it, and acknowledging it would require him to choose a side. So he chose nothing. And in doing so, he chose everything. I lowered my eyes once more, not to escape the moment, but to take it in fully, to let it settle into memory with complete clarity. The broken plate. The scattered food. The quiet tension pressing in from every direction. It was not the first time I had felt something like this. That was the part that surprised me the most. Not the insult. Not the humiliation. But the familiarity of it. Because this moment, as sharp as it was, did not stand alone. It connected to others. Smaller moments. Quieter ones. Moments I had dismissed, explained away, or simply endured. I remembered a holiday dinner not long after Daniel married Vanessa, when I arrived with a homemade pie, only to find that dessert had already been served, my contribution left untouched on the kitchen counter as if it had never been expected. I remembered a birthday gathering where the seating had been arranged so carefully that there was no place for me at the main table, only a small chair off to the side, positioned just far enough to feel separate, but close enough to appear included. I remembered the way plans would change without notice, the way invitations would arrive late or not at all, the way conversations would shift the moment I entered a room. At the time, I told myself it was coincidence. Miscommunication. The natural adjustments of a new family dynamic. I told myself to be patient. To be understanding. To not make things harder than they needed to be. But sitting there, with the evidence quite literally at my feet, I could no longer pretend those moments were isolated. They were pieces. And now, finally, they fit together. I lifted my gaze slowly, not toward Vanessa, not yet, but toward the room around us. The soft lighting. The neatly arranged tables. The quiet murmur that had not quite returned to normal. It struck me then how carefully chosen this place had been. Public enough to ensure witnesses. Refined enough to make any reaction from me seem out of place. Controlled in every detail. This was not just an outburst. It was a setting. A stage. And I had been placed on it with precision. Vanessa had not lost control. She had exercised it. That realization settled over me with a calm that surprised even myself. Because once you understand that something is intentional, it stops feeling personal in the way that pain usually does. It becomes something else. Something clearer. Something you can see without emotion clouding your view. I finally looked at her then, meeting her eyes without hesitation, without anger, without even the slightest trace of defensiveness. And for the first time that evening, I saw something shift in her expression. Not fear. Not regret. But uncertainty. Just a flicker. Just enough to suggest that my lack of reaction was not what she had expected. That perhaps the outcome she had imagined required something from me that I was not willing to give. I did not speak. Not yet. Because words, in moments like this, are often wasted. They can be twisted, interrupted, dismissed. Silence, on the other hand, has a way of holding its shape. Of forcing others to sit with what they have done without distraction. And so I remained quiet, allowing the weight of the moment to exist exactly as it was, unaltered, undeniable. Because the truth was, this was not the end of something. It was the confirmation of it. And now that I could see it clearly, there was no reason to rush, no reason to react, no reason to give them the response they were waiting for. There would be time for that. Just not here. Not like this. The silence stretched longer than most people would find comfortable, long enough for the room to slowly begin breathing again, for conversations at nearby tables to cautiously resume, though softer now, more aware, as if the air itself had shifted and everyone could feel it. I remained seated for a few seconds more, not out of hesitation, but because I understood the importance of timing, the way a moment can either control you or be shaped by you depending on how you choose to move through it. Then, without a word, I placed my hands gently against the edge of the table and stood. The chair slid back with a quiet, controlled motion, not abrupt, not dramatic, just enough to signal that I was no longer participating in whatever this had been meant to become. A waiter approached almost immediately, his expression careful, respectful, the kind of professionalism that comes from recognizing discomfort without needing it explained. I am so sorry, he said softly, glancing briefly at the floor before looking back at me. His voice carried something genuine, something unconnected to the performance unfolding at the table. I met his gaze and gave a small, polite nod. It is not your fault, I replied, my tone steady, my words measured, offering him the one thing no one else at that table had offered me that evening. Respect. He hesitated for a second, then gestured subtly toward the table. Would you like me to bring you another plate? He asked. The question hung there, simple on the surface, but layered in meaning. Replace what was lost. Continue as if nothing had happened. Pretend the moment could be reset. I shook my head gently. No, I said, my voice calm, almost quiet. That will not be necessary. Behind me, I could feel Vanessa's attention sharpen, as if she were waiting to see what I would do next, what kind of scene I might create now that I was on my feet. But there would be no scene. Not from me. I reached for my purse, lifting it from the back of my chair with unhurried precision, every movement deliberate, every gesture controlled. Daniel finally spoke then, his voice low, uncertain. "Mom," it was the first word he had directed at me since the moment the plate touched the floor, and it sounded unfamiliar, as if he had forgotten how to use it properly. I paused, not turning to face him immediately, allowing that single word to settle between us. When I did turn, I did not look at Vanessa. I looked only at him. "You invited me here," I said quietly, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact that seemed to have been lost somewhere along the way. He opened his mouth slightly, as if searching for something to say, something that might explain, justify, or undo what had already been done, but nothing came. His silence answered more clearly than any words could have. I gave a small nod, acknowledging that answer for what it was, then reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet. I placed a few bills on the table, enough to cover what I had ordered and more, setting them down neatly beside my untouched glass. The gesture was simple, but intentional. I would not owe anything to this moment. Not even the cost of a meal I never truly had. The waiter stepped forward again, quietly assuring me that it was not necessary, but I simply shook my head once more. "Please," I said, "let it stand." He hesitated, then nodded, understanding that this was not about money. It was about closure. I adjusted the strap of my purse over my shoulder and took a final glance at the table, not at the broken plate, not at the scattered remains of what had been served, but at the two people sitting across from where I had been. Vanessa's expression had shifted, just slightly, her earlier certainty replaced by something more cautious, more observant. Daniel looked down, his hands resting still now, his earlier restlessness gone, replaced by something heavier. Neither of them spoke. And I realized then that they had been waiting for something from me all along. An argument. A reaction. A moment they could point to and say, "See, this is why." But I had given them nothing. And in that absence, something far more unsettling had taken its place. I turned and walked toward the exit, my step steady, my posture straight, the quiet sound of my heels against the floor marking each movement forward. I did not rush. I did not look back. Because whatever that dinner had been meant to accomplish, whatever message it was supposed to send, had already been received. And I had no intention of responding to it on their terms. Not anymore. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, and for the first time since I had arrived, I allowed myself to pause. The door closed softly behind me, muting the low hum of the restaurant, and just like that, the noise, the glances, the tension, all of it was left on the other side. The street was quiet, lit by a row of warm streetlights that stretched down the block, casting long, steady shadows across the pavement. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting lightly on the strap of my purse, and took a slow breath in, then another, not to calm myself, but to mark the shift. Because something had changed. Not around me, but within me. I had spent years trying to understand where I fit in Daniel's life after he built one of his own, years adjusting, stepping back, giving space, telling myself that distance was natural, that things evolve, that love does not always look the same over time. But what happened inside that restaurant was not distance. It was removal. And once you see that clearly, once you allow yourself to name it for what it is, you cannot unsee it. I began walking toward my car. My steps measured, my posture steady, the quiet rhythm grounding me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. As I moved, my mind did not race. It did not spiral the way it might have years ago. Instead, it began to organize, to connect, to place each moment where it belonged. The dinner. The invitation. The careful setting. The deliberate timing. None of it had been spontaneous. And Vanessa, for all her composure, had revealed more than she intended. Because people who act without thought leave confusion behind. But people who plan leave patterns. And patterns can be followed. I reached my car and unlocked it, the soft click echoing briefly in the stillness before I opened the door and sat inside. For a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply rested my hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead, allowing the quiet to settle around me completely. There was no anger. That surprised me. No sharp edge, No rising heat. Just clarity. The kind that comes when denial finally steps aside and leaves the truth standing alone. Vanessa had not wanted me at that table. That much was obvious. But more importantly, she had wanted me to feel it, to experience it publicly, to understand my place in a way that could not be mistaken. And Daniel, he had allowed it. Not by action, but by absence. And sometimes, absence speaks louder than anything else. I leaned back slightly in my seat, my gaze still fixed ahead, and let that realization settle without resistance. Because there is a difference between being pushed away and stepping aside. One is forced. The other is chosen. And for the first time in a long time, I understood that I still had a choice. I did not have to argue for my place. I did not have to defend my presence. I did not have to remain where I was clearly not wanted. But that did not mean walking away blindly. It meant stepping back with intention. With awareness. With understanding. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, holding it in my hand without unlocking it, simply feeling its weight, its presence, the quiet connection it represented. There were things I had overlooked. Details I had dismissed. Conversations I had let pass without question. Not because I was naive, but because I had chosen peace over confrontation. But peace, I realized now, cannot exist where there is no respect. And respect is not something you ask for. It is something you recognize when it is missing. I placed the phone back into my purse and sat there for a few seconds longer, allowing one final thought to settle into place. Vanessa believed she had drawn a line that evening. A clear one. A final one. But what she did not understand was that lines can be crossed in more than one direction. And sometimes, the person who steps back is not retreating. They are repositioning. I started the engine then, the soft hum filling the quiet space around me, and adjusted my hands on the wheel. My reflection caught briefly in the rearview mirror, steady, composed, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. I did not look like someone who had just been humiliated in a crowded room. I looked like someone who had finally seen something clearly. And that, I realized as I pulled away from the curb and into the dimly lit street, was far more powerful than anything that had happened inside. The drive home was quieter than usual, not because the roads were empty, but because my mind had finally stopped trying to fill every silence with excuses. Streetlights passed one by one, each casting a brief glow across the windshield before fading into the dark behind me, and with each passing block, I felt something settle more firmly into place. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer replaying the scene at the restaurant. I was reviewing it. That is the difference. Replaying is emotional. Reviewing is precise. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the wheel, the faint ticking sound of the cooling engine filling the quiet. My home stood just ahead, exactly as I had left it, calm, still, unchanged. I stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, unlocking it with steady hands, the familiar click grounding me in something real, something that still belonged entirely to me. Inside, the air carried that soft, familiar scent of lavender and polished wood, a quiet contrast to the artificial warmth of the restaurant. I set my purse down on the entry table, removed my shoes, and walked slowly into the living room, turning on a single lamp instead of the overhead lights. I did not need brightness. I needed clarity. I sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window, and for a moment, I simply allowed the silence to exist without interruption. No voices. No glances. No careful words hiding sharper intentions. Just stillness. And in that stillness, everything began to align. I reached for the small drawer beside the chair and pulled out a thin folder I had not opened in months. Inside were documents I had once reviewed with only mild interest. Property records. Account summaries. Copies of agreements that Daniel had asked me to sign after his father passed, always presented as routine, always explained quickly, always accompanied by reassurances that it was simply easier this way. At the time, I had trusted him. Of course I had. He was my son. And trust, once given, does not disappear overnight. But now, as I opened the folder and spread the papers carefully across the small table beside me, I looked at them differently. Not as a mother. As someone paying attention. I noticed the dates first. Then the signatures. Then the small changes in wording that I had overlooked before. Not because they were hidden, but because I had not been looking for them. And slowly, piece by piece, a pattern began to form. Transfers. Adjustments. Permissions that had shifted quietly over time. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But together, they told a story. One that did not match the one I had been given. I leaned back slightly, my eyes moving from one page to another, my thoughts no longer clouded by doubt. Vanessa had not acted alone. That much was clear now. Her confidence at the restaurant had not come from nowhere. It came from certainty. From knowing that something had already been secured, something that made her believe I no longer had a place to stand. I closed the folder gently, not out of frustration, but out of understanding. Because this was no longer about a single evening. It was not about a plate on the floor or a word spoken too loudly in public. It was about control. And control, when built quietly, can be just as powerful as anything done openly. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the soft glow of distant lights, the calm that had always existed here long before any of this began. For years, I had told myself that keeping peace meant staying silent, that avoiding conflict meant preserving family. But now I understood something I should have seen much earlier. Silence does not preserve anything when it is used against you. It only creates space for others to decide your place without your voice being part of it. I turned away from the window and looked back at the folder resting on the table. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt prepared. Because whatever Vanessa believed she had accomplished that evening, whatever message she thought she had delivered, she had also done something else. She had made everything visible. And once something is visible, it can be addressed. Not with anger. Not with confrontation. But with precision. I picked up the folder once more and placed it neatly back into the drawer, closing it with a soft, deliberate motion. This was not something to react to in a single night. This was something to understand fully, to approach carefully, to handle in a way that could not be undone. I turned off the lamp and stood there for a moment in the dim light, my reflection faintly visible in the window. Calm. Steady. Focused. They believed they had already defined the outcome. They believed the line had been drawn and accepted. But what they did not realize was that I had not even begun to respond. And when I did, it would not be in a crowded room, or in raised voices, or in moments they could control. It would be where it mattered. And it would be final. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet, steady beginning that does not demand attention but invites clarity, and I woke before the sun had fully risen, not out of habit, but because my mind had already settled on what needed to be done. There was no hesitation, no lingering doubt, just a calm awareness that the time for observing had passed and the time for acting, carefully and precisely, had begun. I moved through my morning slowly, deliberately, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft light fill the room as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. After a few minutes, I walked back to the small drawer beside my chair and took out the folder again, placing it neatly on the table in front of me. This time, I did not skim. I reviewed. Each document, each line, each signature. I traced the timeline with intention, noting when things shifted, when permissions were adjusted, when authority quietly moved from one place to another. It was not messy. It was not careless. It was structured. And that told me everything I needed to know. When I finished, I closed the folder and sat still for a moment, letting the full picture settle into place. Then I reached for my phone. There was one number I had not needed to call in years, but I had never removed it. Some things, once important, remain so even in silence. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm, professional, unchanged. I introduced myself simply, no explanation, no emotion, just a request for a meeting. Not urgent. Not dramatic. Just necessary. The kind of request that does not raise alarms but ensures attention. We agreed on a time later that afternoon. I ended the call and set the phone down, feeling no rush, no anxiety, just a quiet sense of direction. The rest of the morning unfolded with the same steady rhythm. I dressed with care, choosing something simple but composed, The kind of outfit that does not draw attention but carries presence. I gathered the documents, placed them into a structured folder, and checked everything twice. Not because I was unsure, but because precision matters when clarity is your only advantage. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, the sky clear, the world continuing as it always does, unaffected by the small, personal shifts that change everything for those who experience them. I drove without distraction, my focus steady, my thoughts organized, not scattered. By the time I arrived, I was not thinking about the restaurant, or the words spoken, or the silence that followed. I was thinking about facts. About ownership. About authority. About what had been assumed and what could still be corrected. The office was exactly as I remembered it, quiet, orderly, neutral. A place where emotion does not lead, where decisions are made based on what is written, what is signed, what is documented. I was shown into a room and seated at a large table, the surface clear, waiting. When he entered, he greeted me with polite familiarity, his expression attentive but not intrusive. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not offer assumptions. He simply listened as I placed the folder in front of him and opened it, turning each page with care, explaining only what was needed, nothing more. There was no need for dramatics. The documents spoke clearly enough. He reviewed them in silence for a few minutes, his eyes moving steadily across the pages, his posture unchanged, his focus precise. When he finished, he closed the folder and rested his hands lightly on top of it, looking at me with a level of attention that confirmed what I had already understood. Something had been done. And more importantly, something could be undone. We spoke briefly, quietly, outlining the steps required, the process ahead, the details that would ensure everything was handled correctly. There was no urgency in his tone, but there was certainty. And certainty, in moments like this, is more valuable than anything else. When I left the office, I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt aligned. Because this was never about proving someone wrong. It was about restoring what had been quietly taken under the assumption that I would never notice, or worse, that I would never respond. I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the same steady calm settling around me once again, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to reflect on the previous night. Not with anger. Not with regret. But with understanding. Vanessa had believed that public humiliation would define my place. Daniel had believed that silence would avoid responsibility. But both of them had overlooked something simple. I had spent a lifetime building, protecting, and understanding far more than they had ever taken the time to see. And now, as I walked toward my car with steady steps and a clear mind, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had not ended anything for me. They had only revealed where I needed to begin.